All good fantasy worlds need a map. It's just that simple, and that's what we're talking about today. No time to waste, nothing more to it, so let's get right down to business. There are all sorts of provisions you might hear about what you need to make a map, understandings of plate tectonics, tides, erosion, and all that sort of thing. And I'm here to tell you up front that you have free will and definitely can do that if you want, and it would be cool, but it does not even remotely approach necessary, even if you are looking for a pretty realistic result. I've made a lot of maps, so hopefully my experience from all that cartography will come in handy by helping you make your own. But there's no better way to start than with part 1, outlining. Outlining here is meant in a both literal and figurative sense. Yes, we will be literally outlining the continent or regional forms of your map, but if you haven't already decided, this is also where you figure out what types of landforms you might actually want. A lot of the early stages of map making are very experimental, as you might expect, and if you spend even several hours drawing and redrawing continent shapes, that is going to be pretty normal. It can be difficult to get that specific look or feeling that you want out of a continent. But before any of that, we'll have a quick discussion about exactly what platform you might want to use to make your map. And thankfully, I'd say your options here are pretty expansive. Anything from drawing it by hand to using programs like Ibis Paint can work. I personally use Incarnate simply because it isn't very expensive and is very flexible, though it does take some learning. So while what I'll be talking about will be done in Incarnate, I'm going to keep it all program or method agnostic, so that this should be useful regardless of what exactly you're working with. One thing that might be worth mentioning, especially once you've got things like towns down, is having a way to actually interact with them or integrate the map in general into your world building project. That's where today's sponsor, World Anvil, comes in. Writing is complicated. World building is complicated, especially when you're working with sci-fi, fantasy, or other speculative fiction genres. Keeping track of all the relevant information, from characters to countries to magic systems, can be tricky, and it's very easy to get very disorganized. However, World Anvil might just be the solution to those problems. It's got a ready-made template and format for all your writing and world-building needs, making it easy to get all your information down and keep it in proper order. Need templates to keep track of character information? World Anvil's got it. Need an interactive map so you can develop the unique personality for each country, town, and village? World Anvil covers that. Need templates for magic systems? Once again, World Anvil has come prepared. Even timelines feature is something World Anvil can help you organize, and let me tell you, the histories of fantasy worlds get very detailed very fast. And having a visual indicator to keep it all straight can be invaluable. All put together, it can really get you that wiki vibe where all your world building is part of a solid ecosystem, where you can jump from one topic to the next with ease and add it to any given subtopic as needed. So if World Anvil sounds like the answer to your writing and world building needs, check them out at worldanvil.com and use the coupon code JBAT for a 51% discount off any yearly membership. That's worldanvil.com, which will be linked in the description below. Once again, that's code JBAT for 51% off an annual plan. Thank you for not skipping the ad. As part of the unique format of this video, we're going to break these sections of facebat talking with sections of me actually making a map. So let's cut to me actually putting one together like so. All right, here we are in Incarnate. We're going to be making the island of Islandia for our example today, famous for its being an island and being a place. So we're going to start with basically a shape. We want it to be vaguely like that, but obviously we're not going to really use something like that. But we're going to start by sort of intuitively figuring out what we want this shape to sort of be. Often just sort of scribbling, I guess you could say, can get you somewhere as far as shapes go, as far as kind of weird coastlines go, especially since our goal here is more or less just an island that's not meant to really be all that big. We can sort of start with something like that, and you basically, every now and again, especially when you're doing outlines, you want to zoom out and you want to see, what does this look like to me? To me, this looks like the USS Enterprise a little bit from Star Trek, because it's got a big saucer and then a little body. So we need to figure out what to do about that. I would say we need to give it an appendage somewhere. We need to sort of build out in a direction. So we might throw something over there. Trying to make it an island though, so we want to cut that. Maybe throw a little bit of something over there. Throw a little bit of something over here, you know. Probably connect those because they might not be too stable otherwise. Stable's maybe the wrong word. And this is a bit too round. Might do that. Now, of course, when it comes to making continent outlines, there are all sorts of methods from, you know, the rice method, tearing paper, all sorts of things. For me, I've found that it is really just down to drawing sort of random shapes, connecting, zooming out, and then just sort of seeing when they look good. So, for example, we can sort of see what's our problem right now. Our problem right now is that this thing looks like a turtle. It's got a shell, and it's got like a head, and then it's got its really screwed up looking limbs. So we need to fix that. One, this. It's too, like, sort of formulated compared to everything else. Now, obviously, with geography, not everything has to be super consistent, but if it's going to be inconsistent, you have to make it maybe inconsistent in consistent ways is a good way to phrase it, especially when you're in sort of similar areas. So we're just going to throw a little, maybe just a little more jaggedness into it, a little more roughness into this general shape. Even if we like this general shape, we're just throwing a little more personality into it, you know? A little more pizzazz, they might even say. And then here, our problem is, well, now what I'm seeing is I'm seeing the head of a guy whose, like, back is broken, and he's like, and his legs are kind of dangling back there. And he's like, I don't know. I could say where my mind was going with that, but I'm not going to. But anyway, we don't want this. So we're gonna sort of pull away from the troubled man kind of iconography going on here, and just sort of scribble on it until we sort of get something else, something a little different in the feeling, in the tone. And as said, you know, this can take hours, and I'm trying to do this in a more controlled environment, so naturally our result may not be as perfect, but I do think one of the best things I can do while making such an imperfect example is basically explain where the problems that you'll find, especially in these early stages, are, because sometimes you might not notice them, or you might notice them and then not know what to do about them. So the next thing I'm actually going to do here is I might give us a bit of an inland sea, even if this is just meant to be an island. So I guess in this case it would be a lake. We'll just put it right there, make that a bit more of a unique shape. And we'll leave some of these sort of imperfections in here. And another thing, of course, to consider is that the larger scale something is, the more the roughness of it matters. Because say we're looking at this tiny little island here, if this whole thing that we're looking at here is like the size of, I don't know, Ellis Island in New York, then this is something you could step across, you know, in a couple seconds. If this is the size of Europe, then this is several miles long. So just keep that in mind. Another good stage here that I often find is that you can do just as much by subtracting land as you can by adding it, especially because then you tend to leave yourself these sort of like weird islands, these weird kind of remaining land masses that end up looking fairly natural most of the time. Just be sure not to cut out too much, or well, I feel like it's fairly obvious you won't leave yourself with all that much left to actually work with. So do it tastefully, to the best of your ability. You might even have the island like almost become two islands here. Maybe this area floods over fairly regularly. Maybe there's a road that is paved over here, regularly gets flooded. They have to maintain it. Maybe they don't even bother to, and they just say, you know, don't even bother to go over there unless it's, you know, low tide or whatever. All that sort of thing. Always be thinking about those sort of details. That's really how you bring these fictional locations to life. So with that, I think we've actually got a fairly solid outline for our island. Now I actually think it maybe looks a little bit like a crab, like slightly. It's like it's almost its eyes, almost its claws. But in this case, it's sort of an abstract enough thing that I kind of like it. So that's good enough for me. So we're going to move on to biomes. Now, biomes in an island like this that's pretty small aren't really going to matter all that much. But, you know, we'll still do them. We'll say, you know, they've got some sandy beaches. I should probably put the sand above the water. Say they got some sandy beaches, especially on the crabs of the crabs of the claw. Yes, J-Bat, that is exactly what it is. On the claws of the crab, we'll say. Make sure they've got plenty of sand around there. We'll say this is actually maybe a fairly tropical environment. So in such a case, we might even make all of the ground just a little sandy. Not very sandy, but just like a little bit. You know? Just slightly. But then we look at it and see that that actually doesn't look very good, so we're just not going to do it that way. And instead, I'm just going to continue adding sand to the coasts. And of course, wherever something is a little too thin, you can imagine that it would all get sort of washed over by sand. For example, right here, I could leave this little bit of grass, but it would potentially look a little strange. So do I want to leave that, or do I want to fill that in with sand? I think I'm going to fill it in with sand, but maybe not that. And there we might have a bit of a lower opacity transition. So because this is a magic island, in which we're not actually going to worry about realistic biomes that much, and I just want to show you something. We're also going to have snow just up here too, just so I can show you a couple techniques you can do with things like ice that you may find interesting. So the island of Islandia is both on the equator and in the Arctic at the same time. Don't worry about the the mechanics of that. It simply is the case. So first, upon kind of getting our snow line there, we're going to get probably like a third opacity, and we're just going to kind of draw that under to sort of give everything below it a bit of a sheen, bit of a Charlie sheen. There we go. And maybe just not that much. Then, even though you can barely tell, just a little bit below that at like opacity 10. And then maybe some at opacity 20 to make this division in of itself a bit smoother. There we go. So, say you want to add some ice to the equation. You might go into your background here and throw that into places where the ice is sort of contained, you know? It's like there might be some ice up to here. Maybe not here because it's actually still fairly open, but maybe kind of in the pockets right here there might be ice. Maybe right here, maybe even especially right here or right here there might be ice. Could be even right there. And while we might not be getting ice in all of this, we might be getting it in these little fringes. Food for thought. And past this point, we might just throw in some trees. So we'll be very, stereotypical with it. We'll get some palm trees. Now, since our island here isn't meant to be very big, the distribution and the scaling of these stamps can be fairly, low density and large in scale. But if this island was meant to be a lot bigger than it was, say once we moved on to the trees of the forest, which would probably be more like deciduous trees, which is a word I suppose I don't know how to spell correctly, we would maybe be looking at a density more like this. So we've gone ahead and finished adding some fairly simple biomes to our crab, the crab of Islandia. And we've also made the land around the forest here a little darker, added some wintry trees around here. It's all very basic, but hopefully it sells the idea. After this stage is done, we should have the basic outline of our continent, maybe a few biomes set up, and the rough ideas for where we might be placing certain political entities. It's at this point we can bring the lens a little lower with Part 2, Key Features. If you go into pretty much any region of the world, there's going to be some core part of the natural environment that everybody thinks about when they're associating ideas with the region. I live in Appalachia. Our defining feature is the mountains. If you live in central Brazil, your defining feature is the rainforest and the Amazon River. If you live in southern Algeria, it's the Sahara Desert, and on and on. These kinds of features in particular, that being ones that are difficult to traverse, often define political borders. I've talked about this a bit in previous videos, but the absolute worst thing I can see in any fantasy map is if they have a border between two nations just cut through an open, unobstructed field somewhere. Especially if there aren't cities or settlements projecting those borders out into said empty field. Especially if you're writing in a world without, GPS, the only way pre-modern people ever knew what land was theirs and what land was some other guy's was based on what town they were in or what side of a natural feature they were on. I'm on this side of the river, so I'm in Lord Bingleford's territory, and then I step over it, and then I'm on Lord Dingus's domain. This was pretty much how things worked, and your maps would do well to reflect this in some way. I mean, look at Spain and France. The Pyrenees Mountains have divided these two vague regions for almost all of their history. And it's so obvious looking at the region that it doesn't demand basically any explanation as to how. Even the most recent time they did really fight each other during the Napoleonic Wars, guess what? The defender, Spain, alongside Britain's help, was victorious despite being militarily inferior. The cities themselves that you are writing and putting into these maps, of course, should be placed around favorable geographical features. Mountains are often good places, especially towards the bases of them, as there might be rivers outflowing, mining opportunities, or just other general advantages. Obviously, green rolling fields are helpful too. Coasts are also just where people tend to gather, whether they be river or ocean coasts. And, I mean, that's kind of obvious. Places where water is accessible has been where any living creature has gathered since the beginning of time. Rivers themselves are another important feature that actually deserve a bit of a mention here, because they can be a bit tricky to do well. I'll gladly admit I am not perfect with rivers. But the thing to keep in mind is that they always take the path of least resistance. If there's a valley to follow, if there's a downhill to go, that's where they're going to be. And through erosion over time, they'll make that valley or that downhill deeper and steeper over time until it becomes a chasm and a canyon and so on, often, but not always, leading to the ocean. But let's return to our map. However, of course, our next priority is going to be adding towns. So what we might actually want to do before that is add a couple of rivers, because towns sure do like to appear near rivers, or maybe even near mountains. So let's say, because we've got a small island here, let's say there's one great big mountain on Islandia, a great big mountain known as Mount. And outflowing from Mount, there is a river. We've also got Lake, of course, but built kind of at this crux, this crossing point. We're going to have probably this channel's third incarnation of the city of Playston, which will make a little visually different from other things on the map by giving it a red title. Because why not? Because we can. But we might also say that, elsewhere, Playston has its big rival, Townton, kind of on the west near the coast. Maybe we'll move it up here because it's got easy access to the forest and some trees. But they aren't alone, as up in the almost frozen but not quite frozen part of Islandia, there's Fort Cold, the final settlement of Islandia. As long as all of your cities have a reason that at least kind of makes sense for the tone of whatever you're doing to be where they are, it'll more or less make sense. And I'm also, just because I find the idea of the island looking like a crab to be amusing, renaming this map to be Crablandia. With those details added in, we can move to part 3, Refinement. Now we have our core features down and we can start to sort of rediscover everything and add in perhaps some microbiomes. Swampland, smaller lakes, wider river basins, places where the forests are denser, where they grow sparser, that sort of thing. All of this will help your map become more alive and vibrant, especially because real places don't have that sort of sci-fi planet monobiome syndrome. More than anything, and this is something I noticed in myself only fairly recently, is scale. Scale is extremely important with maps, and though it might be something you can only really help well if you're working with a program where you can quite literally just scale objects or entities within it up and down, I'll still make a point of it. In earlier stages of my world map, and we'll just take this little bit of it as an example, the cities and their names on it were very large relative to the landforms. At first glance, maybe it's not a horrible look, though my immediate calling attention to this fact probably does have you suspicious of it. But then look at it once I've shrunken it down, not even all that much. Doesn't it just look a bit more natural this way? I've still got some size, so it's visually distinct from everything around it. You can still tell it's important, but it no longer dominates the landscape. The rest of the terrain has more room to breathe, and the continent itself actually looks bigger. So, an important note to be made about scale for sure. But for this section of the map part, I'm just going to make note of the changes made to my actual existing maps over time, and the improvements I think I've made in my methods. I'm not afraid to show where I've gone wrong because I've done it many of times, and of course I've still got room to grow. So now that we're at part 3, we're going to leave Crablandia behind and go through the stages of all of the maps that I've worked on before. So this was the region map for my very, very first D&D campaign that was run several years ago. Yes, I know that I basically called these forests Forest 1, 2, and 3. And here you can sort of see demonstrated the problems with one, scaling, as I'd say the trees are a fair bit too big. The outline on the map is sort of, and the coasts, I guess more accurately, is not very pretty. And generally, it's a bit lacking in features. Though I may have made this with the free version back then of Incarnate, but I don't remember. But, you know, we all have to start somewhere. I'd say the next significant step along my journey was a bit later when I made a map for a more conventional D&D campaign that was very, very subject to the problem of obvious, extremely rigidly delineated biomes. I mean, they are literally bordered out. Not to mention, I stole almost all of the names of the towns in here from Fire Emblem Three Houses, but don't worry about that. But here, I think a lot of the problems of novice map making are very obvious. There isn't a whole lot here that isn't basically just towns. All of the forests are just sort of sparsely populated trees. Everything is sort of weirdly distributed. And the mountains are pretty much just borders. Not to mention the fact that this shape, this kind of L shape, is everywhere. If we move even further into the future, we have yet another more conventional D&D style campaign, though this one didn't actually go very far. But I do think the map for it was an improvement over that last one I showed you. Biomes are now sort of starting to naturally blend into each other. The scaling is still a little dicey, but things are starting to improve, even if this vampire area does basically just look like Cuba. For a campaign following that we actually did finish, we were back to my own world with a very northern vibe campaign. And here we had some, I would say, significant improvements over the previous. This forest is ridiculously thick, but is so for a important, I guess you could say, lore reason. Forests sort of spread out from each other. They remain dense in certain areas. Certain details might be hard to parse because we needed the hexes to measure distance. But now I've even got things like roads marked out, which are another thing I'd actually recommend you do. Roads are worth, even if they're not paved roads, marking out to indicate what the most traveled paths might be. And then we'll conclude with a map that hasn't actually made its way into a D&D campaign yet, but that I have made very recently, which is an expansion off of my main map that is just directly to the east, where I tried throwing in just a bunch of new shapes, new concepts, and also pulling further away from the real world-ish shape that my main map had. Here we've got lots of weird biome blending with things I haven't really tried before. It may not have gone super perfectly, especially around here, I would say. But, you know, we're all always learning. We've got fun things like the big hole in the ground, Mount Guran, you know, wastewater disposal. Wastewater disposal too. Good stuff. But even if I'm not able to go over these in extreme detail, I hope you can see how experience does end up making a difference, even if it's in things as minor as varying distribution of trees and forests. But with that done, we've got a bonus part, a very quick one, part 4, Ambiguity. But what if you don't want your characters, players, or readers, whoever's engaging with your map, to know everything about it once it's done? This is a question I don't think gets asked nearly enough. I'm running a tabletop RPG campaign right now in which none of my players, including my editor who is working on this video, has access to the full version of the map of the region they are in at the moment. When the campaign started, they only knew this much. Then as it advanced, they uncovered more and more of it until, at its current extent, they know exactly this much. Will they have discovered it all by the time the campaign is over? Who knows? But in either case, this kind of ambiguity, the idea that the whole area the story concerns may not have even been mapped out yet, is a lot of fun, and I would love to see it done more. But anyway, that'll about cover it for our discussion on fantasy maps. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have any thoughts of your own about fantasy maps, I read every comment and would love to see them. In addition, every like and subscription goes a long way for us. We also have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos a week early. On that note, I'd like to thank those patrons of ours: Shadowrunner, Sani, and Isaac Parrott, our Knights of the Inner Circle, Nico, our Knight, and Greer, our loyal squire. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, your map may be good, but it'll never be Ninjago's. Ninjago video when?